And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network. Here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center in the heart, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of 1,000 stories. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Please, the heart and soul of independent media is in fact social media. You have a moment, you haven't, please take time to follow us on the Facebook as well as the mighty Twitter. As I mentioned a couple of times over the last week, we're engaging in our own little bit of what I call a coalition-a-thon, which is a kind of a low-key, hopefully not terribly lame attempt to raise funds to support the show. You can support us at the Patreon website. Just look up the Coalition Radio. And if you're an independent business and you're looking to advertise your show for a moderate amount of money and to reach thousands of people a week, please reach out to us at coalitionradioshow@gmail.com. On the line, we've got someone who is beyond a repeat offender. She's been a regular part of the show, on and off for the better part of the 5 years that we've been in business. Yep, Bella, this show has been on for almost 5 years. Yikes. Sex worker.
Time flies.
It does. Sex worker rights, otherwise known as human rights, have been a part of this show since the outset. We talk about third rail issues. Unfortunately, in the year 2019, it would appear that the rights of an individual to use their body in a consensual personal relationship where commerce might be involved is still considered evil, is looked down on, it's trivialized, it's made sport of, it's demonized. The notion that we haven't evolved at this point as a society and a culture is, to put it mildly, and I'm putting it very mildly because this is family radio, disappointing. And the fact that Providence, Rhode Island, which in many ways, from its history as the birthplace of religious freedom, as the true, by the burning of the Gaspee, the true beginning of the American Revolution, would still find itself limited by its views on consensual sexual relationships is, again, I'll use the word disappointing. A state where the LGBT plus community is so welcomed, despite some challenges, but is so openly welcomed, is so in such an important part of the community, but at the same time, survival sex work is sort of with an embarrassed glance downward walked away from. And the notion that we have made criminal here in Rhode Island, we've actually gone backwards within recent years to criminalize, again, consensual actions between adults. Well, that's horrifying. So someone who's been on the leading edge of this, the bleeding edge, sadly, is our good friend Bella Robinson. She is the executive director of an organization called COYOTE, or RI. COYOTE stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. It would appear, despite some of the legislative losses of the last few years on a national level, for things like FOSTA and SESTA, and then on a local level where we decided to recriminalize sex work, it would appear that there are some bright green, as they say, shoots appearing through the snow, that there are legislative challenges being levied, and there as at least now what appears to be the beginning of efforts to truly understand, as opposed to minimize, as opposed to render cliche, what's really involved in consensual sex work. So Bella, welcome back to the show. In an effort to kind of keep it a little bit, I say humorous, I don't know how quite to understand this ongoing Robert Kraft story, but right as I was about to go online, you flashed me a story. What's going on with Mr. Kraft? Who is our president seen with?
Okay. Well, it all started with the big headlines that Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, was arrested in this Florida spa, where Homeland and local law enforcement in Florida claimed that these women were, international sex trafficking ring, that the women had visas and were promised jobs as waitresses, and they weren't allowed to leave the building. And now they're really backpedaling. Not only are all the women in the United States legally, they had massage licenses. So you have to go to school for 1,800 hours, take your state board, and you're licensed by the state of Florida to be a massage therapist, because massaging without a license is a felony, yet prostitution's a misdemeanor. So they're backpedaling. They're still lying in the media and saying that the owner was arrested for trafficking, and I believe she was arrested for pandering, money laundering, or something else, but it had nothing to do with trafficking. Mm-hmm. So they're backpedaling that story. And of course, even now that we have the real facts, thank you, Elizabeth Nolan Brown from Reason Magazine, who pulled the police reports to put this together. And they checked there's no other charges of trafficking. We're now finding out that President Trump was actually at an event for Super Bowl, and the woman that used to own these spas before she sold them recently is in the picture with her. And this woman and her family has donated a lot of money to Trump and a lot of politicians. So when you see the picture, it kind of makes you think that he's probably visited places like this or engaged in this kind of activity himself. But, the main thing is, why is the police lying and calling prostitution or sex work trafficking when we know it's not? And they were saying things like, oh, the women had to, sleep on massage tables. Well, they actually had beds. But even if they did sleep on massage tables, the police don't care how many people are sleeping in their car in Tent City, right? Mm-hmm. And this idea that they weren't allowed to leave the business, none of it was true. We've also seen this, if you Google biggest FBI sex trafficking ring is bogus, you'll see another article by Reason Magazine where they arrested a bunch of people and called them gang members, and they were all college students. It had nothing to do with prostitution. It had to do with a 14-year-old runaway who was upset that her boyfriend didn't pay attention to her, so she started sleeping with a lot of his friends. And the mother told the FBI they could not interview the girl, so they went behind the mother's back and visited the girl at school 30 times and coached her to talk about money and prostitution. And after 2 years of these people being held in jail, the charges were dismissed and they were released. But a lot of this ties into the money trail. The police and the trafficking NGOs are getting up to $500 million a year to create awareness, to advocate that the public snitch on sex workers, to rescue them. They're training the maids in hotels to look through your luggage for condoms and electronic devices while you're downstairs at breakfast. And it's really just about increasing mass surveillance on people involved in the sex trade. And it's really based in racism because, Asian women are really being targeted. They're under attack from ICE. They're being detained at airports. The Marriott Hotel is now going to harass any woman that sits at the bar and has a drink alone. Mm-hmm. I believe there's a restaurant in New York that no longer will let women sit at the bar and eat dinner if they're unescorted. And now women are really upset because what are you implying, that everyone's a sex worker? Or so that narrative, it just goes on and on and on. But we've got it in the public records. We've got proof the government is lying.
Mm-hmm. It's astonishing the twists of logic that take place in order to fit their description, in order to rationalize and justify their efforts at quote unquote law enforcement. The serpentine would probably be the most polite term. But they're hell-bent to prove their thesis regardless of the facts.
Right. And you know what it reminds me of? It's very much like abortion. And we just saw this at the State House. And we saw it on Twitter with rumors like, do you know the hospital now allows women to take a baby home and then abort it? Like, how is that even possible? So they start with this hysteria. They start with these outright lies. They start the name calling, we're baby killers, we're the pimp lobby, we don't care about selling young girls. But interesting enough, there was just a study that showed that nearly half the children and adult sex trafficking victims were abused by the police. We also have another link of, dozens and dozens of cops, rapists with badges and guns and handcuffs. We have police officers that rob, exploit, solicit, pimp, and kill sex workers, pedophiles and child porn, the cops, judges, DAs, FBI agents, Secret Service agents, and other government officials who can't keep their hands off of minors, and also the domestic violence by law enforcement. So there's actually thousands of police officers in the United States that have been convicted of raping children. And a lot of times they get probation or only 3 years in prison, and they don't have to register as a sex offender, and they're not even decertified so they can move away and become a police officer again. We have a recent case here. I'll send you the link when we're done. It's involving Central Police officers accused of misconduct and sexual assault. So they were sexually harassing female dispatchers, and when they complained about it, they would change their shift, and they would put the person that was harassing them as their supervisor. And finally, in the last case, the woman went out for a drink with one of the officers, and he had a bag from Walgreens of cold medicine, and when she came out of the bathroom, her drink was ready, and when she got done drinking it, she saw this residue in the bottom, and she barely remembers going home. She woke up, she had been assaulted. He left his sunglasses on the back porch, so she knows it was him that came in the house with her. And when she went to the ER to get the rape kit, after the nurse left the room, the doctor came in and said something about, this is a shame that something like this could ruin someone's career. Like, how do you say something like that to a rape victim? And then meanwhile, all the other police officers in Central Falls are covering up for them, and they're lying. And this cop that, again, they have the documentation of the reports. So there's a big culture. It's almost like the church, where the priests are trying to hide up. Rather than clean it up, they're trying to cover up and protect their name, rather than to just admit predators can sneak into any sector of our lives. I don't care if you're a teacher, a cop, a church, a reporter. This idea that predators are supposed to look like some strange homeless guy, predators look just like everybody else, and they're from all walks of life. I mean, there might be people that we know personally that we see on the news one day and say, damn, I would have never believed he would have done that. I thought he was a nice guy. But I also want to point out that police officers beat their wives at double the rate than any other U.S. professional. And we're seeing a high rate of women that are being pulled over in traffic stops, being assaulted by police, people on probation, sex workers, drug users, or anyone that police think is uncredible that will not be believed and probably won't report the attack. We're also seeing this with domestic violence, where they go out to a call and they take hubby to jail and they tell the woman, we're going to help you and your 2 kids, and the officer returns a few hours later and has sex with her. And she might be too scared to say no because he's got a badge and a gun, and he's already mentioned her children. That puts you even in a more vulnerable situation. And I think it's pretty clear that a domestic violence victim is probably not hot and horny just hours after she's been beaten up by her husband. So one of the things that we're doing to try to roll back some protection is Senator Sam Bell is introducing a bill, Senate 317, and it's called Relating to Criminal Offenses of Sexual Assault. And it basically says that if you're a peace officer, which includes police officers, probation officers, correctional officers, anyone that would have a power over someone else, if they engage in sexual conduct with anyone that is detained or in custody, they'll be charged with a felony and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Because we can't think of any reasonable reason, like, if the police pull you over and you say, officer, am I free to go? And they say no, you're being detained. So what right would they have to engage? How can it be consensual at that point? There's such a different power dynamic. And these laws have started to come to our attention because of that big case in New York last year where the 2 police officers pulled over some teenagers smoking weed, and they let everyone go but the 17-year-old girl. They put her in the cruiser, they handcuffed her, they both raped her, and then they dumped her out of the van just a block from the precinct. And 6 or 7 cops showed up at the ER trying to get her not to do a rape kit. So what will happen is before these laws, we've started to change the laws, the police will say it was consensual, and the prosecutor will say, well, we can't prosecute them. It's their word against, her word. So we found out there was 35 states that it was legal to do this. So New York's changed the law, Alaska's changed the law, Maryland's changed the law, Vermont just changed the law, and now we're looking to do that in Rhode Island. It might not take care of all the problems, but at least it'll be a clear line that this is a felony and this is sexual assault.
No, let me jump in for a second. What's astonishing to a lot of people, because I mentioned the issue came up earlier this afternoon. That's when I knew I had to reach out to you about Sam Bell's legislation. There's this conventional fiction, if you will, like when you watch any type of Law and Order style show or any type of crime drama or movie, that the minute the police officer engages in any sort of physical contact with the victim of the sting, and I always use the victim of the sting intentionally because the sex work is real work and should be, if it's consensual, should be allowed and just left alone. But that fiction exists. So folks, I love when you refer to them as normies, the folks who are out in the world doing their thing and not really connected to this issue, are horrified, astonished that somehow any legal protection exists, or the notion that there should almost be a double jeopardy. I mean, we give police so much authority so that when in fact, if that authority is in fact under a trial by their peers, if in fact that authority is abused significantly, and words can't really do justice to the type of situation where you've got a sex worker all of a sudden feeling, you mentioned the children, and anyone who's got any association with family law and how it impacts sex workers in today's society understands that you're only a phone call or a bad day away from losing your children. A not so insignificant part of the population of sex workers are engaged in some form of survival sex or some type of sex work directly to support their children. So they're Bill, I mean, they're just astonished that this could exist in the year 2019. Yeah.
And you know what we call it, Pat, is we call it state-sponsored rape. When a police officer is allowed to engage in any sexual contact during a vice sting or investigation, that's state-sponsored rape. But the reason we didn't include it in this bill is Tara Burns did this in Alaska.
Right.
And when she tried to do the next bill that said, okay, now that cops can't engage in sex with people detained or in custody, now we want to go further. We want to stop them from engaging with sex with people under investigation or victims or witnesses of crimes. And during the hearings in Alaska, I've got the video, the police started complaining about who would they be able to date. So if you're a domestic violence victim and I come out, I'm the police, and 6 months later I bump into you at Walmart, would I be able to date you? And it really became about who they could date, but I know a lot of it was it's because the sex workers were under investigation. So when it comes to the general public, we can all say, oh no, police officers shouldn't be doing this. But when it comes to sex workers, that idea that bad women get what they deserve is still sticking. So the reason we're taking this in baby steps, we figure if we can get this one passed this year, next year we can try to bring another one that would include sex workers and victims of crimes. But we didn't want to give them a reason to shut this one down. We want to at least get this one, these are harm reduction steps. Even if we don't get everything we want, there's still little pieces of the puzzle. So we thought it was best to do it one step at a time. But I want to point out another thing about the Kraft case. So what happened is they sent a cop in there. The woman solicited him, and they got a warrant to install a camera. And they had the camera in this business, spa, for 6 months, recording over 100 men having sex with these women. Now, if we really thought it was trafficking, why would we allow 100 men to abuse these women over 6 months when, obviously, after you had 2 or 3 of them on tape, that would be enough to raid the business and arrest people, right? So once again, they claim we're victims, but they treat them like criminals, and there's no concern for the health and safety of the women. And it's the same thing. When a police officer engages in sex during a prostitution sting, he doesn't know if it's a minor or if it's someone that was forced or is a consensual sex worker. So for somehow when the police can engage in it, it's okay. And that's supposed to be traumatic, but when you're a consensual sex worker and a client pays you, everyone flips out about it.
Right.
And we consider when the police use forced coercion or fraud during a prostitution sting, it's more outrageous because that's the definition of human trafficking.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And to me, what's appalling is that these individuals are using their uniform, the powers afforded them to engage in behavior that is reprehensible, the impact to the community. And let's go back to something like Ferguson. I always remind people that there were 2 Justice Department studies about Ferguson, Missouri, and the riots there.
Mm-hmm.
One of them had to do with the actual events of the riot. The other, far more interesting, quite frankly, was what were the events, the mood of the community that precipitated the environment, the dry grass, if you will, that something like that could explode in. And part of that was that as a community, they no longer saw law enforcement as someone who would, quote unquote, protect them. They began to see law enforcement as an invading force who was literally there to profit from them. And when that happens,
police would come in and tell you what to do if you were lost. Yeah. Think about that now. Would you want the police coming into your school and talking to your kids nowadays? Because you're right, they're not our friends.
Well, societies has crumbled in part because there's the threads of trust that existed between law enforcement and the community have been completely shattered in significant parts of this country, particularly the inner cities. And quite frankly, there's a preponderance of active sex work in the cities. So you've got this me against them attitude that's precipitated by invasive laws, an out of control law enforcement community that has become highly militarized. And because
they also want to go to poor communities of color, like when they do End the Demand a couple of years ago, they went over to, they'll do it in Cranston, or they'll go to Woonsocket, or they'll go to Pawtucket. So they'll go to poor communities of color to do these things. They don't do End the Demand up on Federal Hill, where the nice white middle-aged men are, who are the clients. Right. We also see this, because we're a nanny state with not just parking tickets, jaywalking, smoking in public, anything that they can cite you for. Mm-hmm. Years ago, there used to be a beat cop that walked around the neighborhood, and he stopped in local businesses. And if something really bad was going on in the neighborhood, people would tell them, hey, this so-and-so is robbing old ladies and stealing their purses. Right, because they weren't trying to nitpick and arrest everyone for every little thing and harass everybody. So there was more of a cooperation when something violent or bad was going on. Now no one wants to cooperate with the police. I just read another article that Reason did the other day where a woman went out to a location, and the officer asked her to film, and another officer tried to arrest her for filming. And we know that any police officer should know anyone can be filmed in public.
Right.
It's your right to film in public. They can ask you to stay across the street and stay out of their way, but they can't take your phone. They can't tell you to stop filming, but we see them do that over and over and over again. And even things like if they give you, a police officer can tell you to jump up and down, and if you don't do it, they can arrest you for not obeying an order, a lawful order. So you're right, the culture's changed where they're the bad guys, and we actually teach people things to do rather than call the police, because when the police come to your neighborhood, people die, dogs get shot. And for instance, say something was stolen out of your car or your house and you need a police report for your insurance. Well, rather than call the police to your home or your car, why not just go to the local precinct and file a police report and get a copy of it for your insurance?
Right.
We're also suggesting that just because someone looks weird in your neighborhood that you don't call the police unless they're damaging your property. Maybe it's kind of best to mind your own business or ask the person if they need help. And this plays into all these recent calls that we're seeing of people calling the police on people for being black at universities, at dog parks. And they're never charged with filing a false police report or using 911 inappropriately. I think if some of them were charged for that, maybe they would stop doing it.
As far as I'm concerned, if you see something, say nothing. You know,
yeah. When Bush started that, after 911 with the trains and stuff, I read something that there was tens of thousands of calls and tips that came in. None of it was ever related to anything to do with terrorism or to catch a real bad guy. It's all bullshit. I get if I see a package somewhere at the airport that I should report it if no one's standing there. But other than something like that, well, look at John McCain's wife. She just called the police at the airport because a woman's toddler was a different race than her.
Right.
So she assumed that the toddler had been trafficked. Like, no one's trafficking 2-year-olds for sex. Let's come on. No one's kidnapping kids in public anymore. There's cameras everywhere.
Right.
Very, very few times is that someone actually forced into prostitution. We see, I would say, 98% of trafficking victims are minors engaged in survival sex, because even if they're under their own control, they're classified as domestic sex trafficking victims.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I think less than 2% are, and then there's a big gray area when when your abuser can threaten to call the police and get you evicted and have your children taken away. That really does give people power to control you. But most sex workers we surveyed said once they got away from their abuser, they were able to go on and to do sex work independently. So it's really you're adding like a domestic violence component to it. And we can't report these crimes and tell you who the bad people are because we're threatened with arrest or arrested. And those predators go on to do it to many, many more victims. And a lot of times the victims aren't sex workers, they're ordinary women.
Right. Now, and if you are, once you are labeled, it's sort of like getting into a gang database. Once you are labeled.
Exactly. And actually places like New York and San Francisco, they can arrest you for having more than 2 or 3 condoms. And in some places like Arizona, they have a law called manifestation of prostitution, where basically if you're known to the police, they can just arrest you on the spot. They don't even have to try to solicit you and get proof. So we see this a lot with trans women of color, especially in places like New York. Like every time they leave their apartment to go do laundry or go to the grocery store, they're not even a block down the road and the police are stopping them, frisking them, harassing them. So it's very similar to the gang database. And I'll give you an example. I once read an article about some church that went out and saved the street girls, and then they got upset when they started marrying men in the congregation. And it goes to show, once you're a whore, you're always a whore. You can't ever be anything else. And while we claim we want to rescue them, there's still something other than us that we don't want them to be a part of. Mm-hmm. We find out when it comes to public shelters, especially domestic violence shelters, the staff and the other women will create so much hostility that the sex worker will leave, go back to the streets or go back to their abuser because they're causing so much trauma. And it's really that these good women don't want to breathe the same air as a sex worker. And 30 years ago, the same thing was happening to gay people, right? Uh-huh. You could be arrested, you could beat a gay guy up in the street, your neighbors would come out and cheer you on. That violence was normalized. But violence towards sex workers is normalizing violence towards women. And while we know there are definitely male and transgender sex workers, most of the violence in the trafficking narrative is about saving young, good white women from evil pimps with dark skin. That's the narrative. It's almost like Birth of the Nation, and let's create this hysteria. Mm-hmm. And the sad part is we've talked about before, there were never any resources to lift people out of poverty, so they could exit on their own or maybe do sex work less. A lot of sex workers I know that are mothers have regular jobs. They just do sex work to supplement their income because they can't earn a living wage, So, yeah.
No, it's
But the government does have a big interest in lying about this. And it's funny because when they lie about other things, they're called out. But regardless of what the government lies about, within the next news cycle, it's over and no one ever holds them accountable.
folks. If you're just joining us, Bella Robinson is on the line. She is the executive director of COYOTE RI. I believe one of the nation's oldest and I believe most pointed ambassadors, civil rights advocates, academically related supporters of consensual sex business. Call off your old tired ethics. Bella has been part of the fabric here now for a few years, advocating for the civil rights and the human rights, really, of folks who are involved in consensual sex here in Rhode Island. Just a quick note, this segment is sponsored by Beacon Shipping and Logistics, beaconshippingandlogistics.com. As we always like to say, professional grade automobile shipping that's based right here in Little Rhodey, out of Warwick, Rhode Island, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. Imagine if you had a car in California, maybe it was grandma's car, and she's not driving anymore, and maybe you could use it here, out here in Little Rhodey. An international shipper exists right here, locally based, that can do it with trust, professionalism, fully insured, quick access to a responsible, real, legit quote, and most importantly, and this is the important part, will not, once they get your quote, sit there and sit on your deal as they try to find a way to make more money off. That's one of the biggest problems in automobile shipping in this time of year. The snowbirds are coming back, and folks who are merely just pure brokers will gather up shipping deals and then try and find a price. Meanwhile, your car sits and sits and sits. So whether it be off of something you bought off of eBay Auto or Facebook, whether it's a vehicle being donated, given to your family, Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT, beaconshippinglogistics.com. As always, particularly this time of year as we're on our coalition-a-thon, we salute the local companies who are willing to support outrage porn-free, third rail, sensitive conversations like the one that we're having tonight. Without them and without your support, we simply could not exist. And conversations like this would be relegated to the 2 or 3 minute sound bites of the local big media. And we know what happens then. Absolutely nothing. So, Bella, let's talk about this legislation for a second. Newly minted Senator Sam Bell has brought this to the fore. Sam has always been an advocate for sex workers' rights in his prior life as an activist. There's a couple of processes coming up in the next few weeks. First of all, do we know when this is going to be discussed in the Senate? Is this going to be? Is it scheduled yet?
It's scheduled for a hearing on Tuesday, March 2nd. Excuse me, March 12th. Tuesday, March 12th. Mm-hmm. It's going to be in room 313. Mm-hmm. The session starts about 6 o'clock, but we're probably not going to make it up to. They won't be working on Senate Bill 317 till probably 7, 8 o'clock at night because there's a few bills in front of it. Mm-hmm. So we'll be sending out a listserv how people can send letters in to support the bill if they can't make it to testify. But I'll tell you another thing that has come up too. We've documented in Rhode Island that there are a few police officers that are taking street-based workers behind abandoned buildings and saying, "Do me, or I'm going to take you to jail." Now, these are the most poorest, most marginalized, dysfunctional people that you can find. They're on the street. And then, when we looked at the Foxy case, Bill Rafferty did some good reporting, Channel 10 on it. And remember the story about Wild Zebra? The police lieutenant is on detail there. His girlfriend's a bartender. They go home and get in an argument, and he beats her up. Now, isn't it a conflict of interest that a cop is doing detail at a strip club where his girlfriend is a bartender?
Yeah.
How is that okay, right?
All right.
And then we had the Boston cop with the gun who got, with one of the girls that was arrested from Foxy's, and the two girls ended up in jail with no bond while he only got paid leave. And again, so if this happens to dancers inside a club with police and bouncers, what does it turn out like when a cop or a predator shows up at your hotel or picks you up on the street? How does that dynamics play out when you don't have all that protection around you?
Right.
Not too good.
Right.
So now that leads me into the next bill we want to talk about.
Right.
On March 14th, on Thursday at 3 o'clock, we're going to be holding Rhode Island's first sex worker lobby day in support of H3, excuse me, I want to make sure I say it right. Hold on. H5354, which is a House resolution to creating a special legislature committee to study the health and safety impacts of revising commercial sexual activity laws. So everybody's flipping out, and the word decriminalization is not even in this bill.
Right.
But this bill is asking to bring together a dozen people. It would have it guarantees a member of COYOTE a seat on the commission, but health people, a couple senators, a couple people from the House, someone from the Public Defender's Office, someone from the Attorney General's Office, someone from the Police Association, and we basically just want to review the data because there's so much bad research. And we have a lot of data to support harm reduction policy. So I'm going to give you an example. Like we were saying, 98% of sex trafficking victims are minors who are under their own control. And we can agree that minors should be engaged in sex work, right? So rather than shake down the strip clubs for $2 each to walk in a strip club to come up with $2 million to pass out to trafficking NGOs and the police to combat trafficking, maybe we should hold DCYF accountable for the broken system, the 320 unlicensed foster homes, the children that have died in state care, the $1 million lawsuit. Maybe we should invest in some LGBT halfway houses and youth drop-in centers, because arresting and rescuing teenagers engaged in sex and then taking them up to day one for some counseling and dumping them back in the same foster homes they ran away from is kind of not a solution. We also know when minors in state care complain about physical or sexual abuse, their complaints are ignored. They look at them like they just don't want to follow the rules, like they're uncredible, and somehow when you're abusing children for free, no one has a problem with it. And I also want to point out that none of these trafficking people are outside these churches demanding that the priests stop raping children. None of them are advocating for $15 an hour or affordable housing. It's just like the pro-lifers. They're not advocating for anything poor mothers need. They just want to force you to have a baby. Right?
Yeah.
So it comes into the, you know, the same situation is they don't want solutions. Their goal is to try to abolish porn, prostitution, and strip clubs, which isn't even realistic. We've been around since the beginning of time. But if we can work on reducing poverty and reducing violence, it would probably reduce the size of the sex industry. And what we do know after criminalization came forward in 2009, the size of the sex industry in Rhode Island hasn't changed at all. So when they do a sting and they arrest 10 or 20 people once or twice a year, they could do that every single day of the week, 365 days a year. But, you know, it makes the public think they're on their job, right? They're doing it, and it also keeps our community in fear. Fear is the next person, the police is the next person going to harm me. It stops you from being able to report violence. Yes, it lets predatory police and other predatory. We also have guys that run around with fake badge raping sex workers and robbing them. You know, but we can't report them to the police.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've made so many advances in this state on how we report drug interactions gone bad for medical reasons. Yet at the same time, we leave. Here's the desperate, critical irony. The sex worker, you know, help industry, the day ones of the world, purport, and I use the word purport politely, purport to be only concerned about the health and welfare of the sex worker themselves, when in fact their actions continually place sex workers at harm by placing them at difficult interaction with law enforcement, with the community of folks who use underground techniques to terrorize sex workers, and generally create an environment of greater harm. If in fact their purpose is to do no harm, they fail miserably on a day-to-day basis and routinely put people's lives at stake because law enforcement interactions are done at their own risk, literally physically and spiritually, and literally create an environment where they've driven people back to the streets. And the same folks who claim to want to take abortion and not return it back to dark alleys are doing that on a daily basis with consensual sex workers. And
right.
It
comes to abortion. Think about all the stuff that happened to them trying to shut down Planned Parenthood. We know Planned Parenthood doesn't spend any federal money on abortions. They don't give out free abortions. You got to pay for them. So these women, to get a few people not to have an abortion, were ready to let millions of women not have mammograms, pap smears for cervical cancer, STD testing, birth control. Without birth control, there's going to be more pregnancies and more abortion. That's common sense. So they refuse to do harm reduction, but it's even damninger when it comes to sex work because of federal law. Trafficking in Persons report says sex worker-led organizations cannot access harm reduction money because they claim it promotes prostitution. But you could access harm reduction for substance abuse, and no one would accuse you of promoting drug use, right? And they also keep saying that prostitution causes trafficking. There's no evidence of that anywhere. That's like saying marriage causes domestic violence. So just because they keep saying it doesn't make it true. And globally, we know from Australia and New Zealand, when you decriminalize sex workers, you just about rid the industry of exploitation. It improves the relationship between the police and sex workers. Sex workers can report crimes. They can sue their employers for sexual harassment. They have labor rights. And a lot of this is about a class war. They don't want sex workers to be the same class. They want them to be second, like drug users, and, we're going to label everyone as a criminal, and, don't believe anything they say. It's a class war. It's a form of oppression.
Right. They seek to marginalize entire
in many
communities.
hearings, I keep hearing them say, what about the victim? What about the victim? And I go, why don't the sex workers count? Why did the violence on the sex workers count? Why do we only care about if you're forced, then we care about the violence, but if you're consensual, then the violence is okay. And this again shows that they don't really think they're victims. They're just calling them victims because it gets society on board. If they told the truth that we just hate sex workers and want them to die, some people might say that's not real nice. But if we claim save the children, save the victims, we can get people on board with that.
Now, is there any way, and let me just explain to the audience who might be new to the issue, FOSTA and SESTA was legislation promulgated at the federal level just this past year, which effectively rendered any type of electronic communication between anyone who is actively engaged in consensual sex work and or their clients and or reviewing agencies and or any one of a number of electronic platforms which allowed them to advertise their activities, and made that criminal under the guise of being a form of or supportive to sex trafficking. Now, anyone who's listening to this,
exactly, because they're conflating the both.
Right.
And this is why I think there's many reasons they're unconstitutional. But Hulk versus U.S. of 1913 says the federal government cannot make prostitution laws. It has to go state by state. FOSTA is obviously a prostitution law that's a federal law because it conflates consensual adult prostitution with trafficking. And let's backpedal to Dart versus Backpage.
Right.
So that was crazy Sheriff Dart in Illinois who sent letters on the sheriff's stationery to Visa and MasterCard implying that they could be charged with some kind of charge because they were processing money for a Backpage and they were claimed were sex traffickers. And this is what's really crazy. The federal judge ruled, he says, I know there to be legal sex workers. They're strippers, they're dominatrix. You can't just claim every ad's a prostitution act. But that's exactly what FOSTA did. And let me point out that right before Backpage got raided, they had actually closed the adult section like Craigslist. And in the casual encounters in the dating section, all you could post was a picture and a phone number. There wasn't even an ad. So are they saying that any female's picture and phone number anywhere on the internet is a prostitute? They're not even defining what a prostitution ad is.
Now,
but another horrible effect of this is we've talked before about if a sex worker works alone, they can only be charged with a misdemeanor for prostitution. But if two of them work together, they could be charged with pandering or promoting. Or in Arizona, they actually threaten the women with like criminal enterprise, 35 years. But if you plead guilty, we can give you probation. They just want them to plead guilty. They know sex workers are safer working in groups. But another thing FOSTA did is sharing information. Like if another escort calls me and says, hey, do you know this guy Tom? Here's his phone number. And I look him up and say, yeah, I've seen him before. He's a nice guy. They're claiming that that's organized crime and that's promoting prostitution. They're also claiming if a client goes on a website and leaves a review for a girl he's seen, he might even be making it up. We don't even know if it's true or not that he saw or these things happen. Because I personally had people put things in reviews that I know I'd never seen. They didn't know what neighborhood I lived in, or they claimed one guy claimed I had my sister in the bathroom. My sister's never even been to my apartment. She lives in another state. But this was his fantasy, thinking, oh, her sister's in the bathroom. I wonder if I can do a threesome with them. So you can write a fake review, and you can be charged with promoting, which is a felony. And a lot of this is, I read a case in Florida years ago where they convicted a sex worker for prostitution. And the judge says, wait a minute, you didn't even prove that prostitution occurred. So he threw out the conviction. And it goes to show that any woman accused of prostitution can not get a fair trial with an impartial jury because society has been taught to hate us. So think about it, if you were in a murder case, if you're on the jury, they would ask you, has anyone in your family been murdered or a victim of a violent crime? They want to make sure you're not biased, right? But when it comes to taking someone to court for prostitution, there's no way to make sure that nobody's biased.
Right. And there was an infamous case in New Jersey just a couple of years ago where someone who was a manager of an adult entertainment spot, if you will, was posting on a couple of messenger boards that couples had shown up and, they were swingers looking for, not even pay for, consensual activity. That was conflated under current law that individual posting that online, because they were paid and because there was an admittance fee to the club, was in fact promoting prostitution.
Right.
When in fact it had
exactly
nothing to do with that. But my question is now, we're going on, we're starting to approach, I believe, a year anniversary, don't hold me to the date, of the passage of FOSTA and SESTA. Anyone even anecdotally or even somewhat remotely connected with the area of question, consensual sex activity, or someone who's been following it as an academic, someone who participates in it, or someone who's a political activist, understands that a significant amount of sex work has been driven underground, that has become more dangerous because of the elimination of review boards, that communication between sex workers now has been rendered, as you put it, potentially a felony, which can have all sorts of impact on these people's lives. So there's no question that it's been driven down underground. Is there any...
Think about a misdemeanor prostitution charge.
Right. Is there any...
If you're arrested for a misdemeanor, even if you're innocent, no one's going to spend $10,000 to go to trial and get an attorney.
But is there my question?
Think about it. If you were accused of a misdemeanor, now I'm not saying prostitution, but just anything. Who's going to spend that kind of money to go to trial?
Right. When
you can just plead guilty and pay a fine, or get probation, or plead no contest.
Right. But my question is, have folks at all been able to measure, and this is one of the most challenging parts, because now, much like drug interactions, it's gone underground, people are afraid to report. But is there any measurement yet of an increase in violence upon sex workers? We
ran an after FOSTA survey within 2 weeks of FOSTA passing and Backpage being shut down. It showed that the poorest of sex workers were thrown out of their hotels with their children because they couldn't pay their rent. Because think about it, every day you post an ad, you make money, and one day you go and the internet doesn't work. And you got no way to make money, right?
Right.
And your rent's due. We also saw that screening went down 28%. 65% of sex workers reported taking on clients they normally wouldn't see. And I personally had a pimp text me from New York, texting me, come to New York and make $5,000 a week modeling for a Victoria's Secret. Well, I'm not that dumb, but some people are that dumb. They don't know better. Right. And had I went to New York, I'm sure I would have ended up being a real trafficking victim, right?
Right.
So, and what we do know is once sex workers had access to the internet, 85% of them went inside. It became safer. And Scott Cummings just did a research project where it showed that when Craigslist opened casual encounters in different cities, female homicide rate across the country dropped by 17%. He also monitored TIER over years, the Erotic Review Board, and could see the majority of the sex workers were independents. So, because you could see who was working for an agency and who's an independent, and you can also tell by what the guys are saying in your reviews. So we do know that the majority of sex workers are under their own control. They're independent. But I also understand why some people might choose to work in a massage parlor or a strip club because they don't want to rent a separate apartment, or they want to work 2 or 3 days a week and leave that life behind when they go home to their children or their family. They want to keep it separate. So it's damning. And the police are even saying that they can't find trafficking victims now. There's no way to locate them. They're already saying that 70% of the ads have already rebounded. So the ads are back. They're just moving out of the country. And I want to point out that Backpage cooperated with law enforcement. They were given an award, I think, of 2012, thanking them for their cooperation. They were reporting hundreds of ads a week that they thought were too young. And the only thing that they lost is because under Section 230, you weren't responsible for third-party content. But in the Jane Doe case, the judge says once they modified the ad, they became the publisher. So if you have the word young in there, they might take that word out, publish the ad. Or you have a picture that's too explicit, they might remove that picture and then publish the ad. Once they modified the ad, they become the publisher. So technically, had they not cooperated, I don't think they would have been in any trouble at all. And they're being charged with the same thing. If you remember, right before Harris was up for her Senate seat in 2016, she had them arrested, held with no bond, and the judge cut them free and said they have not done anything wrong. Bad on you, Harris. These are the same charges. They're not being charged with sex trafficking. Now, Jane Doe also is suing Facebook, and you're going to love this one, Pat, because she says Facebook didn't warn her that it was dangerous or vet this man. So she went on Facebook. She friended a 38-year-old man, complained about her mother, met him at the mall, and he ended up pimping her out. Now, why isn't the parents in trouble for giving the kid an electronic device and not monitoring him? Why isn't the cell phone company that she called him in trouble? Why isn't the mall where she met him in trouble? Why is only Facebook in trouble or Backpage in trouble?
Because they're easily
so it's really it's an scapegoat to blame other people. And when we blame the wrong thing, it's not going to fix the problem. It's not going to help victims. It's not going to reduce violence through trafficking.
We've only got about 2 or 3 minutes.
I believe that this is going to replace the war on drugs. There's a great movie I'm going to watch tonight called The War on Whores. It's on Vimeo. Maggie McNeil from the who writes the blog The Honest Courtesan's in it. I heard it. It's a fabulous movie. I'm going to watch it tonight. I think your listeners probably could learn a lot from watching it.
Yeah, I'll have to send me the link. Now, we've only got about 2 minutes left. So before we engage in shameless plugs of what's coming up, I do have to ask you about Kamala Harris. There is, and you and I ran into each other again this week on Twitter, because there's an attempt to, for lack of a better term, rationalize her behavior as when in her career.
Well, she's saying she doesn't want the sex workers arrested.
Right.
But in the second sentence, she says she wants the pimps and the Johns arrested.
Right.
So she does not for the crim, she's for the Nordic model and the demand. And for years, when she was DA in San Francisco or Alameda County in California, she fought against Prop 35. Prop 35 wanted, like anyone that had ever been charged with peeing in public since 1940, to run down and register as a sex offender and turn over their internet passwords for life, and it was struck down as unconstitutional. So she's never done anything to, and remember Celeste Gape that was, exploited by the 30 Oakland cops? She didn't lift a finger to help that girl. She didn't even do a press release about it. She protected the police who abused her. And the police got an award ceremony that the media was locked out of.
So it's fair to say.
So no one trusts her. She's like Hillary Clinton. She'll say anything to get elected.
And
I think people are starting to realize sex workers are organizing. They are a political power. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are mad at Bernie because he signed FOSTA. But I believe if we sit down and explain the facts to Bernie, he's a reasonable man, and I think he'd come around. I think he just believes all the lies Congress has been feeding the legislature. Congress sits up there and tells them all this stuff. Everyone's 13. Everyone's a victim. Mm-hmm. All prostitution's trafficking. There's hundreds of thousands of victims. Well, if you're giving the wrong information, you're not going to vote the right way. That's kind of common sense. So we really need to step up and start to educate our legislatures and our communities. And supporting sex workers does not mean you approve of it. It just means that you understand it's not okay to continue to abuse them and lock them out of access to the justice system.
And I just want to remind folks, shameless advertising note on my part, that despite, and this is sort of an inside joke, an inside line between Bell and I, despite the presence of a now Republican legislator at an early initial meeting of the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island, I would point out that the only national political party, because the Libertarian Party was on the ballot in all 50 states, that adopted as part of their political platform a pro-sex worker plank that is in fact now on the LPRI website and the lp.org website. You can read, in fact, that libertarians unequivocally support the right of sex workers to engage in consensual sex business practices. So, there's a group of people out there that actually get it already. But I'll just kind of let that one hang out there. Belle, I got to go in a minute, but again, give folks give folks a quick rundown.
Party in support of H5354.
Yeah, run down what's going on this week. How can people support you? How can people get involved?
They can come testify Tuesday for the sexual assault bill for the cops. That's in room 313. Tuesday, March 12th at the State House. Probably start about 4 or 5 o'clock. They can also come to Lobby Day, which is Thursday, March 14th. At 3 o'clock, we'll be meeting in the second floor library at the State House for a small training, and then we'll be lobbying our legislatures in support of H5354.
Excellent. All right, Bella, thank you.
Thanks for your time, Pat.
No, Bella, thanks so much for joining us. Again, Bella Robinson of COYOTE RI, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics of Rhode Island. You can find her on Facebook. You can find her on, what's the website? One last shot.
COYOTERI.org.
COYOTERI.org. If you're looking for an alternative viewpoint as to all these issues as opposed to the pablum you're being fed by the mainstream media, come to the coalition. We've dedicated literally at this point probably close to 100 hours of programming on it. Or, of course, reach out to the source for information, Rhode Island's leading sex worker rights, civil rights activist, Bella Robinson at COYOTERI.org. Bella, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pat. Have a great
day. We'll talk to you this weekend. All right, we're going to take a quick break right now. Going to take a minute or two to read your Chloe Agnes from AIER is going to be joining us. The latest addition to our stable of writing stars. She'll be talking about some of the economic issues of the day. Yes, she's an economist, but she's also a damn good writer. And like our friends at Reason, AIER, and like our friends at FEE, and like our friends at FIRE, like our friends at Reason, they bring forth, like our friends at Goldwater Institute, original writing that analyzes today's news from the perspective of real-world economics in a highly accessible manner. Folks, stay tuned.